Yeah, I think the moment has come. Good evening and welcome to, if I've counted right, the 8th M+ Matters. And as I see that there are some old hands when it comes to M+ sessions here, many of you know that this is a kind of a mix between an internal workshop we do and a public program that we do in M+. As part of the development of simply the museum, it's the thinking around the museum, the collection and so forth. We started almost exactly 2 years ago, and we've been looking at a number of subjects and issues that where we found that we really need to bring in more people to help us to sort of discuss and debate the directions we should go. We've been discussing questions about, for example, Asian design and how to collect that and what that means. We've discussed in a number of sessions ink art and contemporary ink art in the contemporary art context and so forth. We've discussed the Chinese museum boom and its drivers and specific sort of issues around it. And we've discussed the question about archive versus collection, or the sort of borders between archive and collection. And of course the fact that how you draw these lines between what you call one thing and the other actually varies between the different strands that we're collecting, since we're not only an art museum, but we're actually a museum of visual culture, as you know, focusing on visual art, design, architecture, and moving image, to put it very simply. Of course, it's much more complex than that. That's what we like. Now we have been building the collection for a bit over 2 years, and we've come quite a long way. We have a collection of somewhere between 4,000, 4,500 objects in it, and it's really time to start thinking, and of course we sort of do that all the time when we build the collection, that we think about potential stories we can tell, potential displays of the collection, what narratives you can develop with the objects and the works we have. And of course, in a way you can say some of the moving M+ exhibitions we do explore this also. Building M+, which happened 10 months ago, for example, was a look at sort of very, very early tentative look at how can we work with an architecture collection in relation and dialogue with contemporary art, for example, and design. We still have about 4 years to go before the museum is there, and well over 4 years before we can open to the public. Actually, if you look at the site now, there are lots of, it's like a forest of cranes there now, so stuff is actually happening, which is comforting, finally, we say. And of course, that means that we actually have to start thinking even in more concrete terms about also not only how to collect, but also think about how to present and how you link what you collect to the presentations and the stories you can tell. And this is the background for today's theme, which is called Global Museums Collection and Display Strategies Today. And I should say that it's not any global museums. The focus this time is mainly on the art aspect, museums that collect and display primarily art, but not only art. And we have an absolutely, well, we always do that, of course, but I must underline that this time. I think that we have an absolutely phenomenal group of speakers. We have Suhanya Raffel from the Art Gallery of New South Wales, and before then she was, and she'll talk about that also, at the Queensland Art Gallery in blanking. In Brisbane, of course. We have Francis Morris from Tate Modern, and we have Temkin from MoMA in New York. The idea is now that I start with a little conversation with Anne, and we see where that takes us, and then we'll take it in the order that Francis will come up, and then Suhanya. And we will have a discussion, and then after that, they will all three be sitting here together with Dorian Chung and continue to talk, and then also be prepared to answer questions from you. So I think I should invite Anne up to the podium. I think the suggestion is that you take that chair, and we will sit a bit far from each other so we can see the screen. Otherwise, we will break our necks. Next. And yes, sir? You? Oh, sorry about that. I was so wrong. I was so wrong. Dorian will make an introduction first, which I think is very proper, so we know why we are here. So please, Dorian. Anne, you stay put, and Dorian come up. Thank you. And I go down. Thank you, and welcome.
Good evening. So I took Lars right off the stage, and actually Lars has taken some words already out of my mouth, so you're going to hear certain things that he already mentioned that I will repeat here. But just to make it, I'm just setting the stage here. I'm Dorian Chiang, Chief Curator at M+, and the convener of tonight's event, which I may say is highly anticipated, judging from the full house that we have here. Just to repeat a little bit, but make it perhaps a little more official, we're extremely honored to have the three guests, very distinguished guests. Again, they are Anne Temkin, Chief Curator of Painting and Sculpture at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, also known as MoMA. Frances Morris, Head of Collections International Art at Tate Modern in London. And Suhanya Raffel, Director of Collections and Exhibitions at the Art Gallery of New South Wales in Sydney. Their impressive biographies are long and detailed, but they are in the brochure, so I'm not going to repeat that in the interest of saving time. But I will just take a few minutes to set the stage, so to speak. As you see, the title of this 8th M+ Matters is Global Museums Collection and Display Strategies Today. In fact, the word global should be in scare quotes because I think you will learn in the course of the three presentations at this evening that none of the three museums are fully confident or comfortable with the description, or at least that's what I claim. Let's see how it turns out. Rather, global, quote unquote, is a mandate that each museum has seriously considered and then carefully embraced, but it is also an intellectual and institutional question that is rigorously debated and discussed within their own institutions. They make no assumptions about what global is and means, and they question it productively every day. This is something we do also at M+, which is, and I'm sure many of you have heard it many times already over the last 2 years. It is a museum of visual culture rooted in Hong Kong with global perspectives. This parallels what the museums represented by three guests today are doing in relation to their own locales from the positions of New York, London, and Sydney. But it is also important to remember the many differences between these three museums, as much as the shared sense of responsibility of reflecting the world in this age of globalization. MoMA is the museum that defines the history of modern and contemporary art in all mediums, as well as the history of modern and contemporary design and architecture and film. And it's been doing it for the last 85 years since the founding in 1929. Tate Modern is a much younger institution. It is also a main, perhaps its purview is a bit narrower because it's mainly a fine art museum. But it has its own complications and burdens as much as its own glories. Having grown out of the Tate Gallery, the National Gallery of British Art, which has been around since the end of the 19th century. Now, founded in 1880, Art Gallery of New South Wales is even older than Tate Gallery and MoMA. It is also a fine art museum, but it is also a semi-encyclopedic museum where modern and contemporary art rub shoulders, with 19th century Western art, traditional Asian art, and also Aboriginal art. So you can see the kinds of dilemmas that are there. These three museums' origins, evolutions, and contexts are quite different from one another, and definitely from the Hong Kong of the 2000s and 2010s, in which M+ is born and growing. While as a 21st century institution, M+ should think, of course, differently and propose a new paradigm for museums in general, but that is not in contradiction with the models that were set in the 20th century by MoMA and Tate Modern, Art Gallery of New South Wales, and many others distinguished museums, especially since they have not stopped transforming or evolving. So in order to have a rather focused discussion tonight, we'll all mainly speak about the topic of collection, since these museums do a lot more than collecting. But the collection is the spine of any museum. And we'll also talk a bit about what we do with the collection, which is the issue of display in our galleries. This is something that we are constantly thinking about at M+, having, as Lars already said, amassed more than 4,000 items and objects in the collection. But just to sort of kind of give you a sense of reality here, the three other museums' collections are much bigger. And their stories are far more complex, from which we want to learn. So to give you some numbers here, MoMA's collection includes now 150,000 works and objects. Tate collection has, let me get this right, 70,000. And Art Gallery of New South Wales has 31,000. They even have buildings to put the collection in, which will be the reality we'll be in very soon. Again, so sooner rather than later, we at M+ will be dealing with a large collection, only a fraction of which we can show, and we'll be confronted with many questions of how we're going to show best this fraction, and this is something that all museums are struggling with. So I think this is as good a time as any to start the conversation. So to repeat how tonight's event is going to unfold, instead of conventional presentations, we decided to have a series of three conversations. First, Anne Temkin will be in conversation with Lars Nitva, the executive director of M+, whom you just saw up here. Then Francis Morris will be joined by Tina Pang, the M+ curator of Hong Kong art and visual culture. And finally, Suhanya Raffel will take the stage with myself. And again, there will be time for questions and answers, so I'm sure you will have many questions by these stimulating conversations, but if you can hold them until the end of the three conversations, that will be much appreciated. Okay, before starting the conversation, last but not least, I'd like to thank our guests again, who made very long journeys from New York, London, and Sydney. But closer to home, I'd like to thank my M+ colleagues who helped organize tonight's event that you are about to enjoy. Alice Tang, Assistant Curator, Alexa Chow, Curatorial Assistant, P. Lee, Sixth Senior Curator, and our, you guys saw our three very hardworking interns, Jessie Kwok, Brenda Louie, and Tiana Wong. And also West Kowloon Cultural District Authority's Communication and Marketing Department. So thank you. And now, please join me in welcoming Anne Temkin and Lars Nitva.